So I just want to briefly introduce Dr. Regatta. So he was born in Yelareddy Gouda, which I believe is just outside of Hyderabad in southern India. And he has bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees in mathematics and physics from Osmania University, which is in Hyderabad. In 1997, he joined the University of Pennsylvania, the famous group of Jack Lee, where he was a postdoctoral fellow and then a research associate. And then since 2004, he's been at NYU in various level faculty positions, most recently in 2012 being promoted to full professor of radiology and orthopedic surgery. So Ravi is an expert on musculoskeletal imaging, particularly MRI and MRS of the musculoskeletal system. He's got more than 160 publications, an H-index of 44 that I checked this morning on Google Scholar, and about 7,000 citations to his work. So we're very lucky to have such an expert talking to us today on 7 Tesla musculoskeletal imaging. I should also mention that he's a frequent grant reviewer for NIH and also a strong proponent of the ISMRM Society. He was awarded the ISRM Fellow Award in 2016, and in the past he's been the chair of the musculoskeletal imaging study group with ISRM. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen, and Ravi, if you'd like to share your screen, and we can start with the seminar.
Sure. Thanks, Peter, for a nice introduction, your kind words. So today I'm going to talk about the quantitative multinuclear imaging techniques for musculoskeletal diseases. So specifically, I'm going to focus on the 7T, and I'm also going to compare some of the advantages with respect to the 3T. And the outline, some reason I can't move. So the outline of my talk is going to be, first I'm going to show the disease burden, musculoskeletal disease burden in the US in terms of the aging population, and also its prevalence, and also its associated cause and the quality of life. Then I'm going to introduce the 7T, how the 7T is going to benefit scanning at the ultra high field, specifically to the musculoskeletal imaging. And then later I'm going to show 3 case examples. The first one, I'm going to show the sodium MRI for osteoarthritis applications. And the second topic, I'm going to cover the phosphorus spectroscopy and imaging for diabetes, neuromuscular and metabolic imaging, using both static as well as the dynamic phosphocreatine imaging. And finally, close with the bone quality target focus towards the osteoporosis population. So if you look into the musculoskeletal disease burden, from the population wise, especially in a middle-aged population 45 to 64, you can clearly see the trajectory. Around 1996, we have only 76 million population. Now in 2011 is almost close to over 100 million population. The trajectory is increasing very strongly, linearly almost, especially in the population middle-aged 45 to 64, and also the over 65 and above. Whereas in the 18 to 44, we have very minor, almost very stable, around 30 million. And this population is predominantly due to the injury, sports injury or other injuries. And if you also look into the burden in the associated costs, you are able to see almost in ambulatory care or inpatient costs or the prescription or even the residual, and the overall, you are able to see almost 4,000 to 7,000 K per person from 1996 to 2011 statistics. And what kind of musculoskeletal disease conditions is worsening from 1996 to 2011? If you look specifically the arthritis and joint pain, so from 10% to almost close to 20%, so almost double the population within 15, 16 years. The other population is also the osteoporosis population. And on the overall musculoskeletal, this is also increasing almost to 50% kind of thing. But these two are predominantly trajectories increasing, the joint pain or arthritis and the osteoporosis. So I'm going to cover those two the topics, how the 70 is going to benefit in this application. And also if you look into the population by age, especially the 45 to 64, that is a bare middle age, you can see all the musculoskeletal is almost 40% of the population. You're able to see some kind of skeletal disease. And also even arthritis, joint pain, again 45 in the middle age population. Even the spine is also close to 40. And even the injuries also around 30%, whereas in the young I think 18 to 44, you see more injuries, either sports or other related injuries. Whereas the middle age, we always see the musculoskeletal joint pain and as well as the osteoporosis. So how the 7 Tesla is going to benefit specifically to the musculoskeletal applications. So several groups have been done wonderful work, including from the in vivo bone and cartilage, early 2007 by UCSF group. And we also did a lot of work on the musculoskeletal tissue, including the muscle, bone, and the soft tissue. And the Phyllis Worley group done excellent work on the bone imaging on the 7 Tesla. And the Stanford group also did some clinical imaging comparison of the 3T and 70. And the Minnesota group did the parallel transmit system and the hip imaging. Hip image is very challenging because of the location of the organ. And also the Vienna group also done excellent work on the musculoskeletal on the 70. So what are the rationale for imaging on the 70? Of course, the SNR, that is a fundamental thing where population difference is always proportional to the P naught. So we can utilize this signal to noise ratio by increasing the spatial resolution, or we can also decrease the scan times. And also in spectroscopy, the spectral dispersion is larger. Maybe you can do some of these spectroscopy applications where they're closed by the metabolites. And more importantly, it also facilitated the SNR starved applications, especially the multinuclear imaging. So that's where I'm going to focus my talks, specifically target the SNR starved application, sodium MRI and phosphorus imaging and spectroscopy. And the system is also one of the special application that you can do it, and ASL, those kind of things. And recent FDA approval in 2017 also boosts specifically for musculoskeletal neuro applications. At the same time, we also have challenges for imaging at 70, especially the inhomogeneities B0 and B1. And also we need to modulate the parameters according to based on the changes in the relaxation times. And we also have a stronger susceptibility and chemical to artifacts. And we also have an increased SAR in terms, and also that also complicates with the biological effects and also the implant safety. And finally, the decreased wavelength effects also we need to take into effect if you are imaging the body objects, the larger size objects. If you compare the wavelengths around 25 centimeters of 3T is coming to the only 11 centimeters in the 70. So this is one of the example I'm going to show. We are able to image the same subject on the 3T and the 7T for the SNR purpose comparison here. So these are all 3 planes. You can see axial and coronal and sagittal. We can see the 3T, and also we use the clinical standard knee coil. Whereas in the 70 we use the 28 channel knee coil. We can clearly see the gain of the SNR not only in the periphery but in the middle of the object. We can clearly see more than 2-fold increase in the signal to noise ratio. So this signal to noise ratio we can utilize converting either reducing the scan time, or we can also use the improving the spatial resolution. So this is where the other example I'm going to show the spatial resolution example. So this is the 3T, the left side is the 3T. You can clearly see still is high resolution imaging around 270 micron in plane and 2.5 millimeter slice thickness, around 4 minutes acquisition time here. You can clearly see, but you also have a little bit noisy kind of thing. Compared to the same kind of acquisition time, even 3 minutes, you're able to see more crispy, these very small structures. Compared to the brain, these soft tissue structures are very small. And if you use we need a little bit higher resolution to visualize the structures. You can clearly see the menisci, ligaments, tendons, and all the structures, 70 much better than the 3T, even with the same resolution kind of thing. But we can also speed up the acquisition time with a better quality of the images. The first section I'm going to talk about one of the osteoarthritis. This is one of the major burden in the aging middle-aged population. So I'm going to show some of the photo imaging work we have been doing. So what exactly is osteoarthritis? So osteoarthritis affects 40 million Americans, and more than 80% of the people are aged population of 55 and older. The general clinical symptoms are joint stiffness, swelling, bone enlargements, and ultimately the pain. And the current treatment options are very limited, either analgesics or physical therapy, or the knee replacement is the end, the surgery at the end. And currently there is no cure. If you look into the extracellular matrix of the soft tissue cartilage, predominantly the extracellular, we don't have many cells, chondrocytes, less than 1% of the volume. And we have the gradient of the water content about 60 to 85% when you go from deep to the superficial region. And there's a 4 to 7% protoglycan. This is the negative charge glycosaminoglycans. And you also have a neutral, no charge for the type 2 collagen around 20%. So if you look into the cartoon here, so the left side, I'm going to show the healthy structures here. We have femur, tibia, soft tissue, and also you have collateral ligaments, and this synovium you have. And this is a joint capsule, and also the synovial membrane, and also the subchondral bone. On the right side, you can also see the degradation of the cartilage, and also the hyperplasia of the synovium, and also the osteophyte formation, and some subchondral bone remodeling, and also sclerosis. These are morphological changes you can clearly see on this cartoon. Whereas if you look into the biochemical and histological characterization of this disease, you can always see the synovial hyperplasia here, and also the pro-inflammatory factors like cytokines, MMPs, ADAMPs, and as well as the anti-inflammatory also products also actively involved in this cytokine process, IL-1, 3, 13, and kind of thing. Predominantly, you can see the activation of the synovial fibroblasts, and as well as the macrophages, and in terms of, again, the T cells and the B cells. And this is the whole joint tissue, not one kind of cartilage, but you always see the damage on the entire knee joint. And what kind of clinical standard the diagnosis for these right now? The clinical methods generally uses that, again, the radiographs, conventional radiographs is still the gold standard for measuring the joint space narrowing width, as well as the osteophytes. But this detects the gross morphological changes. You can clearly see whenever there is the loss of this joint space narrowing, you can clearly see bone on bone here. And also this is a very advanced stage, and the treatment is not effective at this stage because you lost a lot of tissue matrix. Once you lose the matrix, it's very difficult to generate the matrix. And the knee replacement is always the option, end option. And some of the orthopedic surgeons also use the arthroscopy methods. This is still very invasive and cannot be used for longitudinal monitoring, and also is very subjective and also not quantitative. They insert a small probe into the joint, see how they feel their softness. Based on the softening of the tissue, they're able to grade, and this is also not useful for the therapeutic evaluation. When it comes to the conventional MRI, so most of the clinical radiologists, they always use the weighted images, either proton density or the T1 and T2. Based on that, they're able to characterize the lesion and morphological changes. All these existing techniques are either late stage detectors or the invasive procedures. So when it comes to the quantitative methods, you can clearly see some of the groups have been working on the cartilage thickness and also the volume. And we can also look into the biochemical changes targeting the collagen, because we have two major macromolecules. One is the collagen, and another one is the protoglycans. So there are specific techniques, either T2, magnetization transfer, the diffusion for targeting the collagen macromolecules, and also specifically targeting the glycosaminoglycans. We can use the contrast enhanced based Dijamric technique, or you can use the T1 row endogenous contrast, or the sodium imaging. Again, this is also endogenous, or the CEST method is chemical saturation. So these are specifically targeting the glycosaminoglycans. So if you look at the morphometry, you can clearly see the high resolution always gives the 7 Tesla. You can clearly see the resolution, the femur, different compartments, and you can also do the volumetric rendering of the not only the soft tissue, you can also see the menisci between the femur and the tibia. And one of the interesting thing, what we did the pilot study on the 70, looking this the cartilage morphometry, cartilage thickness maps, you can clearly see that as you increase the grading of the severity, you can see this is the anterior and this is the posterior, and this is the medial side and the lateral side. You can clearly see the loss of tissue in the morphological level here. Whereas in the case of KL1 and 2, we don't see morphological changes, but there is a biochemical changes. And once you reach this stage, morphological stage, you will not able to reverse the disease process. So that's the reason why we are always trying to target the early stage of the disease like KL1 and 2, so that the matrix is still intact, but we can reverse or if possible, we'll be able to reverse the disease process. But whereas here, once you reach this stage, we're not able to reverse the disease process. The first one we are going to show is the sodium imaging. The loss of proteoglycans is the signature of the early OA. And sodium concentration always correlates with the PG content of the cartilage. A number of groups have been shown in the early first paper by 1998 by Reddy group at the UPenn. And these PGs have negative fixed charge density, and the negative the GAG also attracts this positive sodium ions. And these sodium ions also attract the water molecules to maintain the osmotic pressure and also the cartilage integrity. And cartilage strength is directly dependent on the fixed charge density. However, if you look into the sodium is a quadruplet nuclei, unlike the proton spin-off. So the gravimetric ratio is almost 1/4 of the proton, and the sensitivity is very low compared to the proton. And also it has electric quadrupolar movement. And if you look into the relative sensitivity, is very low, almost 3,000 times low compared to the proton. But its natural abundance is always very 100%. And it has 4 energy levels, the central transition as well as the satellite transitions you have. You can always see the central, one central and 2 satellites. The satellite peaks always gives the slow motion sodium, whereas this is the central transition always give the plus or minus half is the free sodium kind of thing. And these transitions may have a different frequencies and also the different relaxation times of T1 and T2. In the extreme narrowing condition, fluids in the slow motion isotropic solution, you can clearly see, you can see only single peak. Whereas in the other extreme, you can always see in the oriented crystals and the oriented macromolecule solids, you can see the 3 peaks here. And you can also measure the quadrupolar interaction. And whereas in the biological tissue, you always see the broadening effect. You don't see individual peaks. That's where the reality when it comes to the in vivo situation. However, if you compare the relaxation properties from the SPINAF and sodium 3/2, you always see the sensitivity is very low, and also the concentration is also very low. Interesting, the relaxation time is also very slow, very low compared to the proton. So we can use especially the T1, shorter T1 is useful for averaging effect. And the T2 also we have bi-exponential phenomenon in the cartilage. So the sodium is very high specific and low sensitivity, and the resolution is very low. Whereas the proton is the low specificity, but it has high sensitivity and the high resolution. So in order to image the sodium, we also need to have efficient RF coils. So clinically, they don't have any the sodium coils. And we also need to have UTE sequences, potentially non-Cartesian sequences, and also you need to have a high gradients performance to get the better quality of the images. So there are 2 types of the sequences most of the sodium imaging people use. Either it could be the radial-based sequences, the non-Cartesian sequences, or it could be the spiral-based sequences. Again, within the radial, you have a stack of stars. In the 2D in plane, the non-Cartesian and the throw plane is the Cartesian. Or you have the 3D fully radial Kushbal or the radial imaging, or you can also use a spiral phyllotaxis kind of 3D radial for better sampling density and also SNR efficiency. And you can also more recently, people are also using the density adapted sequences, kind of modulating the gradient in the readouts. When it comes to the stack of spirals, again, there are different variations, the cones, TPI, and the more recently the flow rate. Again, most of the cones and TPI, they use the spiral sequences. One of the issue with the spiral sequence is implementation a little bit complicated. You need to generate multiple gradient waveforms, and also you need to have high slow rates. And more recently, the flow rate is a little bit more easy to implement. The reason is they use only single gradient waveform. So first, we are able to show some relaxation times in vivo on the LD volunteers on the 70. So this is a representative the T1 maps. So patellar cartilage and femoral tibial cartilage, and also the femoral condyle cartilage. And this is the T2 maps and the short component. You can always see very low, close to 0.5 to 1.5 milliseconds range. Again, all 3 regions, you can the patellar cartilage, femoral tibial, and also the femoral condyle. And again, this is a long component, is around 15, approximately 15 milliseconds. So if you look into the average T2 component is around 0.5 to 1 millisecond, that contributes 60% of the signal. So that's why you need to have very efficient case-based sampling, and also as much as shortest after the excitation, we need to scan acquire the data. And the T2 long is around 10 to 15 milliseconds in the cartilage, but that contributes only the 40% of the signal, and the T1 is around 20, 25 milliseconds. Interestingly, if you look into all the organs, either brain or the cartilage or the muscle, the cartilage has the highest concentration of the sodium, around 250 to 350 millimoles. It also has a shorter relaxation times, 15 to 25 milliseconds, the T1, and also the shortest kind of 0.5 milliseconds, short component are around 10 to 15 milliseconds, the long component. So the next thing what we did, we used is there any gender difference between the relaxation times? So if we are able to see some gender difference in the T1, but not in the T2. We always see higher numbers in the T1 in the female subjects compared to the male subjects, whereas we don't see any in the T2 numbers, always very similar in the male and female. We don't see much differences. And the later we are able to see that we use the 3D radial sequence, and both the 3T and the 7T, we use the same sequences. And we also use the fluid suppressor sequences because there is a lot of synovial fluid and joint effusion in the joints that complicates the quantitation. So initially we use the rectangular pulse, and the later we also use a diabatic pulse to get the better homogeneity for the saturation of the fluids. The reason why we are using the sodium inversion recovery based sodium imaging, this is very similar to the FLAIR in the neuroimaging. Because one is a partial volume averaging effect, because the resolution we get is a little bit coarse resolution compared to the proton, around 2 millimeter isotopic resolution in vivo. And the cartilage is very thin, around 2 to 4 millimeter, and also is curved shape, and even thinner in the patients. So in the presence of synovial fluids of the joint effusion, we always the results are always influenced by this contamination of the fluid. And of course, triple quantum filter is the gold standard for measurement of the slow motion sodium, but it takes long scan times, and also is not possible to because of the multiple pulses. We have to put high SAR, and also the low signal to noise, because only 10% of the single quantum, and also it requires large phase cycling. So initially we implemented this inversion recovery based kind of sequences. On the 7T, we simulated the data, make sure use the adiabatic pulse for amplifying the pulse amplitude and also the offset frequencies, and around 250 and also 1 kilohertz coverage. And we also able to, this is for the fluid sodium, and also where this is the cartilage sodium. And in the cartilage, we are not able to invert completely minus negative direction, because the T1 is very short, whereas the fluid is little bit the T1 differences here. So basically, instead of the triple quantum filtering uses the T2 differences, whereas the inversion recovery based differences, we use the T1 differences between the tissue and also the fluid. We are exploiting those the characteristics. And this is one of the representative example where you can see the conventional without suppressed 3D knee joint imaging. And this is one of the, we also use you can see the popliteal artery here. This is a complete fluid, whereas in the fluid suppressed one, you can clearly suppress here. We also use the PBS as an external reference, also make sure we're able to suppress that phantom. These are agarose phantoms. And then we are also able to do the reproducibility of the quantitative sodium imaging on the 3T as well as the 7T. So we did the same volunteers on the 3T and the 7T, and we also within a week, we repeated the same scans. And we also use the 2 different sequences. One is the conventional radial as well as the inversion recovery based kind of thing. And we are able to quantify the different regions, patellar and the medial lateral cartilage, as well as the condyles. And in the 7T, we did within a week, and again within the 3T also we did within a week, and the same subject we scanned. So session 1 is the 2 sequences. Again, the session 2 also we have the same sequences repeated. The total each subject has almost, we have 15 data sets we have. So we can clearly see the session 1, session 2, and the say day 1 and the day 2. And also we have 3T and the 7T, the conventional sequences without fluid suppression and also with the fluid suppression. You always see the suppression of the signal around 50% of the suppression of the signal in the fluid suppression, but the quantitation is more robust. And then we also measured the signal to noise ratio and also the sodium concentration and 3T and 7T. Although the numbers are same, the signal to noise is a little bit higher at the 7T compared to the 3T. And the concentrations are also very similar, but the standard deviations are very high in the case of 3T because of the signal to noise effects. And we also measured the coefficient of variations, and those are also in the range of 6 to 12% and 7 to 13% across the both magnets, 3T as well as the 7T. Then we did the clinical study, this NIH-funded study is in the subject with osteoarthritis. And again, we did the same kind of thing where you can see the sodium images and also the corresponding proton images. We are able to see the control always have higher sodium concentration compared to the OA patients. And you can always able to see the fluid suppressed one always gives a better area under curve compared to the non-suppressed one. Then later we also did some of the longitudinal study of the same population followed up for 16 months. We are able to see again baseline versus follow-up. Again, we are able to see the scan 1 is basically baseline, scan 2 is the 16 months follow-up. We are able to see loss of the sodium concentration, proteoglycan specifically in the 15 months period. And we are able to quantify these numbers. Again, the fluid suppressed is more sensitive compared to the non-suppressed one and all the compartments, and also the standard deviations are also decreased. And later, we also did the cartilage repair. This is more like a clinical translational work. So some of the orthopedic surgeons, they are able to repairing the focal defects in the cartilage. And conventionally, they don't know whether if you do the proton imaging, they always see the filling the defect. But whether the matrix is there or not, we are able to see it's sodium imaging. For example, this is a 70 proton image where this is the repair site. And you also see some fluid here. And this is the conventional sodium imaging and also the fluid suppressed one. There is no, even though the proton imaging shows there is a defect is filling, but there is no matrix here. You can see the blank here. And you can also see the suppression of the fluid. And this is another microfracture case. You can see, again, the same example. You can see there's a very small amount of the tissue is left. The concentration is always very low. And we are able to see the repair site as well as the adjacent site. We don't see much difference without IR, whereas if you do the fluid suppressed one, we are always able to see statistically significant differences. So in summary, we developed and implemented a quantitative sodium methods with and without inversion recovery, both 3T and 70. Sodium concentration is highly reproducible both on 3T and 70, but the standard deviation signal to noise is low at 3T. And fluid suppressed adiabatic pulse always provide consistent improved quantitation in the GAG, OA patients, as well as the cartilage repair patients. And of course, this is a low resolutions compared to the proton imaging, but sodium is feasible both on 3T and 70. One of the requirements is we need to have a specialized hardware in terms of the RF coils, also the high field systems, and also the customized pulse sequences to get this quantitative imaging. The second section I'm going to cover is the phosphorus spectroscopy imaging, where you can see here the top one is basically the proton imaging, and the bottom one is the phosphocreatine imaging, the phosphorus imaging itself. So why we need to do the phosphorus imaging here? Muscle is almost covers the 40% of the volume wise and also in the human body. And you can see the hierarchical architecture of the cartilage with the muscle fibers and also the endomysium and also different fibers, as well as the entire muscle is started with the epimysium entire muscle, and we can also see the fiber bundles within the muscles. The main mechanical function is to generate the force and also they facilitate the movement as required as needs. And also a physiological function is uptake, the glucose uptake, as well as the storage of the energy and also thermogenesis and also the whole body water balance. The current standard methods for imaging the muscles, skeletal muscle is basically anatomical imaging using the conventional imaging T1, T2 proton density, or the water fat imaging using the ideal imaging or the in and out of Dixon in and out phase imaging. When it comes to the muscle structure, we can also use the DTI fiber tractography, and also the mechanical properties using the elastography. We can also use the muscle metabolism using the intra and extracellular cellular lipids using the proton spectroscopy, or the metabolic activity using the phosphorus spectroscopy, or pathways using the carbon-13 spectroscopy. And also you can also use the muscle function, use the perfusion or the blood volume and oxygenation using the ASL and the flow. So the reason we use the muscle spectroscopy is very, P31 is particularly suitable for studying the energy metabolism and exercise physiology, and also the metabolic disorders in vivo, and also time resolved signals from the PCR, PI, and ATP reflect the physiological changes in the muscle during the rest, exercise, and the recovery. And the P31 MRS can provide potential for monitoring the muscle mitochondrial function, and also the dystrophies as well as the inflammatory myopathies. So when it comes to the phosphorus spectroscopy or imaging, again, the Germer ratio is only 40% of the proton compared to the sodium is 1/4. But this is a spin-off system, you have plus or minus half. But again, the concentrations are very low, around 5 to 30 millimole. And muscle has the highest concentration, around 30, whereas the brain has the lowest concentration, 5 to 6 millimole. Again, the natural bond is 100%. And when compared to the proton chemical shifts, we have very large chemical shift around 30 ppm coverage, and whereas proton is only 4 to 5 ppm. And also compared to the proton, we also need to use a fat suppression, whereas here you don't need any solvent suppression. And one of the interesting thing in the phosphorus, T1, T2 relaxation was very long in seconds. And T1 seconds is not comfortable, not useful for the averaging effect. There's always one of the limitation kind of thing. But we can also use into our advantage using some of the Bayesian methods. And again, the phosphorus is low resolution and also requires long scan times. And of course, MRS is very useful for ISNR and also is very fast, simple sequence and very fast. You can get a higher temporal resolution with exercise. And the coarse resolution and also the limited volume coverage. That's the two disadvantages with the spectroscopy, no spatial coverage. Of course, the biopsy is the gold standard, but it's very invasive on the small volume of tissue and may not be feasible for routine clinical evaluation. So we are able to develop the phosphorus 3D imaging methods using we are concentrating only one metabolite, the phosphocreatine metabolite, and that gives a large muscle coverage and also the spatial temporal resolution. We use both the volume coils. These are double tune quadrature coils we got from the RAPID, and both exact same size coils, and 3T and 70, to study the heterogeneity of the metabolic diseases. So initially we did the spectral implementation of the spectrally selective pulse. So here you can see that this is a proton image where you can see the three metabolites. Predominantly we see in the phosphorus, phosphocreatine, inorganic phosphates, and the ATPs. So we can target specifically one metabolite for imaging in the imaging concept, spectrally selective pulse. Here we are selecting only the PI, where you can see only the PI imaging, rest of the peaks you don't see. Metabolites, if you want to target the PCR phosphocreatine, we can just select only the phosphocreatine metabolite. You don't see other phantoms. Here the ATP. So we want to just make sure the sequence is working. And then we are able to show the static imaging on the 3T and the 7T, the same subject. They are close in the same area, in the same floor. So we are able to repeat the same subject and see the quality of the data. So we use the spectrally selective Gaussian pulse to excite only the PCR metabolite. And we use the turbospin echo sequence here. The reason we use turbospin echo, the T1 is very long, especially in the 3T in seconds, 5 seconds in the range. And even the 70 also is very long. So we can use the echo trend line in the segmented fashion. We can use the 24 KY lines, and then we can collect the data. The only thing is we need to use the central case spacing or sampling here we use. And also the bandwidth also we need to control, make sure we have, because the peaks are very narrower in the case of 3T compared to the 7T. So we need to adjust the length of the excitation pulse to cover the bandwidth of the pulse. And we're able to show some of the SNR comparison here, both 3T and 7T for a 0.5 voxel. So we can clearly see more than twofold increase in the signal to noise. This is the 3T as a function of acquisition time. This is the 70 as a function of acquisition time. Even if you double the voxel size, we can get higher signal to noise ratio on the 70, because this is a 0.26 voxel size, but still is higher than the 3T data. So we can see this is 70. We have a 25 and 50 millimolar inorganic phosphate, and this is a phosphocreatine. If you image, you are able to see all of them. But if you are imaging only the phosphocreatine, you will see only the phosphocreatine. You don't see the inorganic phosphate. This is in the 70, and this is the 3T with the same subject. It's almost signal to noise 10:1, and this is 28:1. And again, the voxel size is small here, around 0.5 ml voxel size. And the slice thickness is very thick, 25 millimeter, 2.5. So the T1, as I mentioned, is almost 3T. We have around 5 to 6 milliseconds range, whereas the 70 we have 3.5 milliseconds range. And the spectral separation from the PCR to the shortest peak is the gamma ATP, around 124 hertz in the case of 3T and 280 hertz in the case of 7T. The line widths are a little bit larger in the case of 70 because of the spectral line widths and the PCR line widths, and also the T1's comparison, and also there is a prime function is around 1 pixel, around 1.5 pixel in the 3T, around 2.8 in the KY dimension. And signal to noise is almost 2.84. And also one of the interesting thing is compared to the proton imaging, you always see the decrease of T1 at the 70 due to the chemical shift anisotropy. So these are representative phosphocreatine maps. You can see this is an image and this is a map, and this is a 70 map. And we are able to see the spectroscopy 3T and the 70, and also we can clearly see the spectroscopic method also imaging the concentrations are very similar. And we are able to show around 9 subjects, all the different muscles we are able to show with the imaging. Spectroscopy is just there's a global number, whereas here we are able to see the different muscles. Anterior tibialis is posterior tibialis, soleus muscle, and the gastrocnemic muscle. Then later we try to do the dynamic studies, because compared to the static, dynamic gives a better sensitivity and the function. And we are able to, initially we use a custom built ergometer. Then later we got the commercial ergometer from the Vienna. So we are able to show some of the dynamic phosphocreatine imaging at the 70 first, and then compare with the 3D with the same subject. So this is the pre-exercise, the resting state. You can see this is the 3T, phosphocreatine, ATPs, and the inorganic phosphate. And the end of exercise, 2-minute exercise, you can see the, and also the end of recovery, you can see the PCR is almost back to 99% recovered. In this, definitely you can see the spectral dispersion. We can clearly see in the 70s benefit going from 3T to 70. Again, the same subject, and the same day we did, we can clearly see the thing, and we can also see this is the resting state, and this is the 2-minute exercise, and then this is the recovery. Then you should be able to cover the mitochondrial oxidative capacity, and the recovery time is around around 25 seconds. Either you do 3T or 70. But one of the interesting thing is, of course, this is very faster. You can do the dynamic scan to the 6 temporal resolution. It has high signal to noise, but no muscle specificity. And also we are able to see, we don't want to do the intensive exercise to change the pH of the signal. So we always measure the pre-exercise and post-exercise. There is no chemical shift between the PI to the PCR chemical shift. Then later we also did the imaging and the 3T as well as the 70. In the same subjects, we got the similar number, but the voxel size is very small here. And the 4.2 ml in the 3T and the 1.6 ml at the 70. And again, when you fit this data, mitochondrial function is again very similar to the 3T and the 70. But one of the interesting things, since we are doing the imaging, we are able to see the individual muscle groups we can target, which is not possible in the spectroscopy. And also we are able to see the spectroscopy and also the imaging, both 3T and the 70, we got consistent results across the field strengths and also across the sequences. And we also able to show proof of the concept in some of the diabetic patients. The recovery is very delayed compared to around 25. We always see some of the muscles are not participating in the exercise, and whatever some of the participating, but some of the muscles are very long recovery times, around 50, almost 100% difference. And some of the work we are able to translate into the 3T, some of them, and this is an NIH-funded DDK study. We are able to see the supervised exercise able to reverse the diabetic neuropathy, and we are able to show some phosphorus spectroscopy and also the proton imaging, and also some of the diffusion on the nerve imaging. So in summary, we developed, implemented the quantitative imaging methods for static as well as the dynamic phosphocreatine imaging, both at 3T as well as 70. Of course, 70 gives higher signal to noise, almost 2.8 fold signal to noise gain compared to the 3T. And we can use dynamic studies, especially the 70 is very useful. Either you can improve the spatial resolution or you can improve even the temporal resolution also. And phosphorus MRS also, and MRI lower leg provides oxidative metabolism, and this could be useful for imaging the biomarker for staging as well as the therapies in diabetic related complications. And of course, this is a low resolution compared to the proton phosphorus, but it gives more specific information, and again requires specialized hardware like coils as well as the sequences. So the last topic I'm going to cover just a couple of minutes, the bone microstructure, where you can see here, this is a fracture subject, maybe this is a bone volume fraction. This is the loss of the trabecular here, where you can see the control, age-matched control subject. You can see the trabecular microstructure, where you can see the head as well as the neck. Femoral neck is one of the risk, predominantly the fractures. And one of the interesting thing is you always see the bone loss of bone mass as well as the microarchitectural deterioration. That leads to the fragility fractures. These are the low energy fractures, almost falling down from the standing height. And also the fracture risk increases as you age. So there is age dependence of bone reduction of bone mass. For example, if you look into the maturation, after 18, also you are able to say around 25 to 30, you see the peak bone mass. And there is a natural age dependence loss of bone mass. And once you reach the 45 to 50, there is also the hormonal loss. And you can see, especially women, postmenopausal women, you can dramatically lose the bone, trabecular bone. And again, even above 60 also, you can see the, again, aging dependence. Age dependence is very slow gradient, but it's a hormonal difference, especially in men as well as women. Someone testosterone hormone or the postmenopausal women, you can see the drastic change in the bone mass. So in the normal balance, you always see the normal plate kind of structure, trabecular bone. And especially in the hormonal postmenopausal, you see the thinning of these plates. Plates becomes the rods. And also even these rods also, as you age, about 60 and above, the perforations, you can see the porous bone kind of thing. So World Health Organization, they developed a protocol for screening the fracture risk using the fracture score as well as the T-scores kind of thing. In the T-score uses basically the standard deviation metric. Either if you have a -1 or above is a normal region, -1 to -2.5 is osteopenia, is early, is a risk for osteoporosis, and whereas below 2.5 and below you always see the osteoporosis and also the severe osteoporosis kind of. These are the scoring system used to characterize based on the density of the bone mineral density acquired by the DEXA. So DEXA is still the gold standard for clinical assessment for the bone fragility fractures or the regular fractures, hip fractures or vertebral, non-vertebral fractures. But one of the issues with the DEXA is poorly discriminates between the subject without fragility fractures. Most fragility fracture subjects have a BMD greater than 2.5. So there's only the BMD predicts only 50% of the fractures. And also this is only 2D information. It does not give the 3D microarchitectural information. And recently people are shown even 54% of these are all the fractures, number of fractures in the women. You see 50% of them have a normal bone mineral density. In the case of non-vertebral fractures also, men also have a 75, 80% they have a normal bone mineral density, but they have fractures. Again, the women is around 56%. So we initially did a microtexture study in the early 2007, 6 and 7. So one of the resident, Greg Chang, now he's the professor in radiology, so he's a MSc chief. He was an Olympic fencer. He brought a lot of friends. When he was resident, he did a small pilot study. They are able to want to see whether these fencers, they always use the force, whether the right hand versus left hand, whether you see the bone and muscle quality. Because there's a use it or lose it kind of thing. It's highly dynamic organs after the brain. If you use it, you can grow the bone. If you don't use it, you lose the bone or muscle. And we are able to see the topological analysis for the surface to curve ratio and the erosion index and both the femur and also the joint level. These fencers always have a better bone quality. And if the left side fencer uses versus right side, we always see asymmetry and even the side, contralateral side. And if we also match it for the age, height, and also the bone mineral, the age and the height and the BMI, this population. And we also try to, once you have the bone 70 MRI, we need to do the post-processing for the segmentation of the bone. And this will give you the bone morphological changes like a bone volume fraction and also thickness and separation of the trabecular bone. And we also use the topological analysis originally developed by Felix Werle group in the early 2000s. And we are using the same concept using the topological analysis where you can see the trabecular plate to rod ratio, as well as the trabecular connectivity, and also the number of plates, number of rods. Those are the things will give you the more microstructural information. So the later we did a postmenopausal women study on the 70 using the fragility fractures. So we're able to, they are close by BMI and the age, there is a little bit difference. So 31 postmenopausal women with radiographically confirmed fragility fractures, either spine, wrist, pelvis, and the mean fracture is around 5 years. And we also did the control controlled postmenopausal women without fractures. And this is one of the representative example where you can see the fragility fractures. This is a 70 image. So the left side is the control and the right side is the fragility fracture patient. You can see, although the density is, bone mineral density is the same, but you can see the architecture is entirely different. And we are able to see the topological analysis. We are able to see the reduction of this fracture case always have the trabecular, reduced trabecular number and increased separation. And also the increased more plates becomes the rods. And also the ratio is also decreasing, plate to rod ratio. And also the connectivity is also reducing. So we are able to, even though normal bone mineral density, but we are able to, using the 70 microstructure analysis, we're able to differentiate or discriminate the population fracture versus without fractures. So another challenging application is one of the hip imaging. So hip imaging also very challenging, either even for 3T. The reason is this organ is a little bit deeper structure, and it's not superficial compared to the wrist or the knee. So for example, if you take the wrist, you only 1 to 2 centimeter depth you need to have. In the knee, 4 to 6 centimeters. Whereas in the hip, you need to acquire the data almost 6 to 10 centimeter deep organs. Signal to noise is always falls off the coils. You need to have very efficient coils in order to get the optimal signal to noise. So we did initially using one of the customized coils using the parallel transmit system to see the feasibility of the imaging. Since we don't have a body coil on the 70, we're able to show some clinical feasibility in the microstructural imaging on the 70 hip imaging. So this is one of the representative healthy subject where you can see this is the high resolution imaging here in the imaging, and also this is a bone volume frame. You can clearly see in the neck they're always a little bit low compared to the head and the trochanteric regions. This is one of the healthy subject. This is we're able to get around 200 micron in plane and 1 meter slice thickness. So this quality is not possible at the 3T. We have to compromise the slice thickness or a little bit low resolution at the 3T. So this is one of the osteoporotic subject where you can see the loss of trabecular in the femoral neck area here. You can clearly see compared to the head kind of thing, and this is the fracture case. So in summary, the bone microstructure assessment will improve our ability to discriminate between the subject without poor bone quality. And the 70 MRI definitely helps in improving the resolution and also discriminating the subjects without bone quality, especially fragility fractures or even the regular fractures. And even though they have the same bone mineral density measured by the DEXA. And the markers of the trabecular isolation and the trabecular plates and rod ratio is very robust measures for differentiating the fracture cases and also the controls. And finally, I would like to thank all my group as well as the collaborators and also the clinical support for providing some of the patients to carry forward this work, and also, of course, the NIH for the funding. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Ravi, great. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful lecture covering a huge amount of material and different aspects of how 7T can be useful for musculoskeletal imaging. We have a few minutes for questions. If anybody would like from the audience to ask a question, if you could type it into the chat box, and I can read the question out. I have one question to start with. I was really interested in those bone microarchitecture images, which look spectacular. I'm wondering, is part of the sort of improvement at 7T is the susceptibility contrast? Is there a sort of microscopic susceptibility effects in the bone that enhance the your ability to image the microstructure, or is it other things like?
Definitely the susceptibility is very high in the 70, and also the T1 is also a little longer on the 70. You can see the marrow. Basically, in the bone marrow, you have the trabecula gives a negative contrast, marrow gives a positive contrast. So differentiating these two always, if you improve the resolution, because the trabecula is around 150 micron thickness. If we use the around higher than more 250, 300 micron thickness, you will not able to resolve the trabecula. So that is one of the reasons. If you push the resolution, especially for the hip, and the signal to noise is very low even for 3T, even low resolution we are not able to see. The two, one is susceptibility, other one is the T1 effect. We are able to differentiate marrow with the fat for the trabecula much better. And if you have this efficient coils, of course, the coils is one of the crucial thing on the 70.
Great. There's a question from Adrian. I'll read it out. Do you feel this imaging in this way will be able to get to a point where it can replace DEXA as a BMD measuring technique? Is it feasible for the calcaneus?
So definitely DEXA is very cheap and cost effective in terms of kind of thing. Bulk screening always people are using, even the clinical trials, DEXA is still using. But in specific applications, that even though the bone mineral density is the same, but we need to have the microarchitecture is very crucial kind of component. for predicting the fractures. Because this DEXA predicts only the 50% of the risk fractures. The remaining 50% we are losing kind of thing. But if you want more accurate kind of thing, even including the fracture tool developed by the WHO, that because that doesn't consider the risk factors like a dose dependent, like a smoking, steroids or the corticosteroids, a lot of smoking and other comorbidities. They doesn't cover the dosage on that. So definitely we have more confidence kind of thing, microstructure, especially the same bone mineral density, because their bone mineral density not able to differentiate almost 50% of the population, where we can use this microarchitectural imaging to quantify the fracture risk in those population.
Yeah, I guess the last part of that question was, could you do it in the calcaneus, which is the large bone in the heel? I assume that would be possible at 7 Tesla.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I think most of the Felix Verley group, Sharmila Majumdar, they started with the distal radius and distal tibia. The reason they started, very easy to image there compared to the hip. But some people always argue because the hip fractures and the vertebral fractures is the predominant fractures compared to the wrist and tibia. But there is a global component, because once you lose in the hip or vertebra, you also lose in the distal radius, and it's like a surrogate. We can always use the distal radius and distal tibia. Most of the Felix Verley group initially started with the distal radius, distal tibia. They're able to predict fracture risk even if you're doing distal radius, distal tibia. Yes, but the more accurate way, maybe there may be 5 to 10% variations when you go from the vertebral fractures or the hip fractures compared to the distal radius or distal tibia kind of thing. But still, it predominantly predicts 80 to 90%. We can always provide a surrogate marker for the hip and the spine.
Okay, I don't see any other questions in the chat box. Actually, I just have one more question. I was also extremely impressed by the high resolution cartilage imaging. But as we discussed, one of the downsides to 7 Tesla is the high cost of the equipment and so on. And so I'm just sort of wondering, in which clinical scenarios this may have an impact, where you really need the improved sensitivity or resolution of 7T, versus offsetting that against, it will be a more expensive imaging test than some lower field MRI or some other imaging modalities. So perhaps you could just comment on that.
Yeah, no, sure. So one of the interesting application, we did one of these cartilage repair procedures. These procedures are very expensive. So these focal defects, these are young subjects, either sports related or some other related kind of, they always lose a focal cartilage defect. The problem with there are different cartilage repair procedures like a microfracture, mosaicplasty, or cell-based kind of thing, but nobody knows whether those procedures are working or not. Each one costs around $30,000 to $40,000 for the procedure, insurance costs. And currently there is no objective evaluation, because based on the clinical symptoms and the morphological imaging, they're able to score whether they are feeling better, those kind of things. But this sodium imaging plays a major role in those patients. Okay, baseline you can get right after 3 months after the repair site. Then within a year you can see some procedures are working, some procedures are not working. We are able to evaluate not only the imaging diagnostic point of view, but we can also evaluate the different repair procedures itself. So there we have a huge impact, because this cost is nothing, because $40,000 versus here, if you, of course the 70 is expensive, but MRI cost, if you can still do 30 minutes or 45 minutes scan, it's still not bad. If you could, of course, if the reimbursements are possible, compared to the 40,000, if you don't know any, whether it's the system, the procedure is working or not, and we can titrate some of the procedures. One of the things we did, one of the microfracture case, we don't see, even though almost 15 months, we don't see any maturation or the integrity. We still see the hole in the matrix. It's not generating. This is predominantly the hyaline cartilage. There is no matrix in that region. Whereas some of the cell-based techniques, basically autologous chondrocyte transplantation, and they're able to improve much better. So that way, at least we can evaluate the procedures also. Not only see how the tissue is functioning, but we can also look into which procedure is working, which procedure is not working kind of situation.
Okay, we've got one more question. Probably be the last one in the chat box, and this is from Mike Share. He's asking specifically about your 31P phosphocreatine imaging. When you do an exercise protocol, when you actually make the imaging measurement, do you stop the exercise, or does the participant continue to exercise, and is there a problem with motion artifacts if you do?
During the exercise also, we continuously collect the data, but we continuously collect the data. We are resting 2 minutes, 2 minutes during the exercise, and the 5 minutes for the recovery. We follow the protocol. So once during we also collect the data, but we are not using, just we want to see because we are using the simple frontal flexion exercise. We are imaging the calf muscle. We don't see too much kind of the motion in that thing, because we are just doing the simple frontal flexion exercise, 1 hertz kind of per second kind of thing. But if you do very intensive exercise, the reason we are not doing very intensive exercise is we don't want to change the physiological pH. Because if we do very intense frontal flexion, we are able to see the pH shifts. So we try to balance kind of thing. At the same time, we also need to have at least 30% minimum depletion in the PCR to fit the data more appropriately. Otherwise, if you have only 10% depletion with the reference to the resting state, you are not able to fit the data. So we titrated the protocol basically using a 30-minute or 1 minute or 2 minute, but also the regimen, we can give the cue and they will follow the cue within the magnet. So that they will do without changing the pH. And we don't see much that problem, but definitely we expect some kind of motion on that, but we don't see that too much motion issue in the calf level when you do the flantar flexion, because these are very thick slices we are using. Because maybe if you use very thin slices, yes, but if you use a very thick slices like 2.5 centimeters, we don't see that much kind of along the direction of the fibers.
Okay, great, thank you. I think we're out of time, so we can all give Ravi a virtual round of applause. Thank you very much once again for a great presentation. And we hopefully will see you in person at the ISMRM in London next year. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Thank you all.